I want to say pragmatism. What's the harm in it? It comes with so many good things, and it doesn't seem to do any great disservice to us. Try it. We'll like it.
Welcome everyone to today's AMA. We are very pleased to welcome Dr. Phil Kitcher. He is John Dewey Professor of Philosophy and James R. Barker Professor of Contemporary Civilization at Columbia University, and received his PhD in History and Philosophy of Science from Princeton. His philosophical interests and contributions are wide in both scope and depth, ranging from philosophy of mathematics, philosophy of biology, philosophy of science, epistemology, metaphysics, ethics, and the various intersections of issues in these domains. His books include The Nature of Mathematical Knowledge in Mendel's Mere Philosophical Reflections on Biology, Science, Truth, and Democracy, The Ethical Project, Preludes to Pragmatism Toward a Reconstruction of Philosophy, Life After Faith, The Case for Secular Humanism, and many more. He has written as well many articles and given many public lectures. And feel free to add more to that or correct if necessary. But with that, welcome Professor Philip Kitcher.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to talk to you.
So I think one thing we wanted to start with, question-wise, is on some of your earlier work, at least in the philosophy of mathematics. So Sep had a question concerning your book, The Nature of Mathematical Knowledge. One thing you say in the introduction is virtually every philosopher who has discussed mathematics has claimed that our knowledge of mathematical truths is different in kind from a knowledge of the propositions of natural science. What is your view about a priorism in mathematics today, and what is the status of that sentence you wrote back then on the topic of mathematical knowledge?
This is a lovely question. I have changed my mind over the course of my career about a large number of things. I think philosophers really do evolve as they go along. But one thing on which I haven't changed my mind is about the a priority of mathematics. I actually don't think that there is anything that is a priori. I think all knowledge is revisable. I think we have no privileged sources in thought that give us any kinds of knowledge whatsoever. And that's really because I see what is traditionally taken as a priori knowledge, and lots of other knowledge too, as being dependent on traditions of socialization that typically extend not only back into our own personal past, but also quite deep sometimes into the historical past. So all of this is, which seems, we seem to be able to sit in the armchair and conjure stuff up, but that's not really what's going on. What makes us able to know things is that we build on the achievements of our predecessors. And so we are always part of an ongoing tradition. I think really from the beginning of my philosophical career, I came to the view that it was wrong to think of knowledge in terms of foundations that were available to an individual person in the here and now, that we are actually profoundly socially and historically involved, and that all knowledge is part of a tradition in which we are interconnected with others. And so the idea of sort of standing back or sitting down, as Descartes did, in a stove-heated room and sort of figuring out a priori what must be true, that seems to be a myth. And I think it's a dangerous myth. And that in a certain sense, that attitude has really hardened throughout my career, and it will be re-echoed again in what I'm writing now. I'm writing a book about inquiry generally across many fields: mathematics, logic, the natural sciences, ethics, aesthetics, politics, religion, and in all of these fields, I'm playing the same tune. It's all profoundly social, it's all profoundly historical, and none of it is a priori.
Great. So we're gonna have a couple questions about your approach in that way about pragmatism, and I see a lot of themes of John Dewey in there as well. But I had another question on the philosophy of mathematics.
Okay.
In your earlier work, first of all, you argued against a sort of Platonism in the philosophy of mathematics, and you put forth what I think is fairly construed as a sort of game formalist approach, where mathematics as a discipline is a sort of a game or collection of games involving the manipulation of meaningless symbols. Is that a view you still would defend now, or?
Absolutely. That actually was not my view in the book. I mean, the book was more constructivist. Now, as I've grown older, I've gone more in a formalist direction and seen mathematics as a series of languages that are devised initially to deal with particular kinds of phenomena in the world. I regard mathematics actually probably as growing out of things like measuring land. That's, of course, the etymological source of geometry, and also trade. Tallying things, keeping records of things, figuring out how many you've got, because it's important to store and to plan. And that's where it starts, and it doesn't really get much beyond that, really, and it seems to me, until the 15th or 16th centuries. And then mathematics really starts to take off, and it becomes pretty clear that the kinds of languages that mathematicians develop, first in algebra and then in the early stages of the calculus, and then in what comes to be known as analysis, that those languages are not just fun for mathematicians to play with, but they can also be applied again and again and again within the growing physical sciences. And that actually, I think, changes the social status of the mathematician. We should always remember that Galileo didn't want to be a mathematician. He wanted to be a court philosopher, by which he meant not only what we mean by a philosopher, but also a scientist. That had much higher status at the end of the 16th century than being a mathematician. It was really only after people started developing these languages, which they did in all sorts of interesting ways, and sometimes in ways that whose significance they didn't appreciate, as with the original development of symbols for square roots of negative numbers. All of this is wonderful unfoldings of symbol systems, and it continues today. And I think that's the right way to view mathematics as a whole.
Yeah, very interesting. Move on to a question about on the philosophy of science. And speaking of Galileo, one of your, in my opinion, very important papers that you've written is called Realism, the Galilean Strategy. I'm
glad you think that's important.
Yeah, it's one of certainly it's been impactful, and I think it's one of my favorite papers that you've written. And you defend a sort of modest realism in that about on science. I just had a question. Do you think that even granting the example that you present in there, or, well, one of the examples you present about from telescopes, do you think that someone might be concerned that how far we can really push this approach, in that perhaps we may not be able to reliably use other tools to make other sorts of inferences, say on Big Bang cosmology, or with electron microscopes, perhaps the inference isn't quite as reliable in that case. What would you think of those sorts of criticisms?
Look, I do think, one of the things I wanted to do in that paper was to distinguish two questions. One is a question really about democracy. Do do very little things and very distant things have the same rights as it were, the large objects that we see in the world around us, the tables and chairs that philosophers love to talk about. And I wanted to attack the idea of an in principle separation of the observable from the unobservable. I think we have good ways of detecting things that we can't observe with our ordinary senses. But to be a democrat isn't necessarily to suppose that every single character has absolutely equal power. And it may well be that certain tools of detection are more reliable than other tools of detection, and that sometimes tracing what's caused something we can observe in the present may prove to be more difficult than it is in other cases. So I'm quite willing to make distinctions among the ways in which we can figure out various aspects of the world. That's fine with me. I just think that philosophers, some philosophers, have wanted to draw a kind of principled boundary to separate the observable from the unobservable, and that I think is a mistake. So I do think real realism begins to do that. I'm hoping to say some more about these issues in the book I'm currently writing, which I think will try to come to terms with why this is such a tempting mistake and why it goes astray.
Excellent. And another distinction, if I recall, I think it was from the same papers, between the sort of working posits of a theory, the ones which are can sort of account for the truth or approximate truth of that theory, and then the idle wheels, like those things which turned out false, that are in a way right along on the theory. And you make that distinction or put that distinction to work against sort of pessimistic induction style arguments, I take it, against scientific realism.
That's right.
What if someone were to grant that that distinction, and that historical scientific theories are still approximately true? What if someone were to say that, well, okay, but a lot of the idle wheels of these theories are concerning, say, unobservables and stuff like that, and so we could still perform some sort of induction and to draw the conclusion that the unobservable posits of our current scientific theories are probably the idle wheels as well. What do you think of that sort of?
Well, I mean, it seems reasonable to concede that if there are idle wheels in our current theories, they will probably turn out to be things that are relatively remote from observation, using the kinds of devices for detection that we have. Now, that's a somewhat different conclusion. It doesn't say all unobservables are suspect. It says that the kinds of things that are most suspect are the things that are most difficult to discern with a range of technological equipment. And that's rather different, I think. But actually, I think there are deeper objections to what I said both in that essay and much earlier in my book, The Advancement of Science, where I originally ran this line in defense against pessimistic inductions from the history of science. I took the example of Fresnel's wave theory. The nice thing about Fresnel's wave theory is that we continue to accept a sort of Bowdlerized version of it. We get rid of the ether, which Fresnel thought was so necessary. He thought that if light were a wave, there had to be a medium in which that wave was propagated. We got rid of that idea, but we kept his description of the mathematics of wave propagation. So I wanted to say that the ether was an idle wheel. Now, the interesting thing is, of course, that Fresnel wouldn't have been able to make that distinction. And so it's quite possible seems to me a reasonable induction from the history of science, that we can't do that either, that we can't see which bits of our own accounts are really doing the work and which are just idle wheels. Now, a former graduate student of mine, a philosopher I admire very much, Kyle Stanford, has, I think, taken this to a further step of sophistication in his book, Exceeding Our Grasp, where he points out that there's another kind of induction on the history of science, namely that when these things happen, when an apparently successful theory gets displaced by its successor, the successor was usually beyond the horizon of possibilities envisaged at the earlier stage. It seems to be sort of beyond the conceptual boundaries of what the earlier people could imagine. And that seems to me right, actually. But I don't think it's a devastating point against the idea that success betokens truth. So now in my pragmatist phase, I'm sort of inclined to the following kind of counter-argument to pessimistic inductions. To believe something isn't, if you're a scientist, isn't to get up every morning and say, I think really there's dark matter, I believe in electrons or whatever. You don't sort of stand in front of your mirror and put your hand on a copy of some scientific book and take a vow. It's to use stuff in a particular way. So to believe in it is to treat it as a reliable way of building as you go on with your investigations. And I think we have very good reason to think that building on success, on representations, diagrams, formulas, sentences that seem to be well supported and successful, that taking those for granted in our further activities is a good strategy. It's a kind of heads I win, tails you lose argument. Because it seems to me that what history shows is that sometimes the successes survive, sometimes they don't. When they don't, it's the fact that people took the successes very seriously and built on them that has led them to the better views. So I say, with respect to a bit of current theory, this is doing really well. Well, yeah, of course, it's possible that in the future the successes will break down and will arrive at something better. But if that happens, I bet that the better stuff will come into being and be recognized by us because we had this attitude of taking very seriously and trusting the things that were apparently successful. So either it gets to be permanent, heads I win, or it leads me to something better, win again. So the realist attitude towards scientific theories, take seriously what's successful and try to build on it, seems to me to be a highly defensible one. That's what I think of as a pragmatic vindication of the success argument.
Great, that makes sense to me. What would you think of another sort of anti-realist argument based on underdetermination of our scientific theories, right? That the data that we have is consistent with a wide number and perhaps infinite number of inconsistent scientific theories.
Okay, so this actually leads into some very interesting issues that I've been occupied with again in my recent inquiries into inquiry. I'm not troubled by this. I think that there may well be rather different ways of representing the world. And I'm going to go thoroughly pragmatic about this, is what we want is one that solves our problems. And that means that all sorts of pragmatic considerations come into making our choices. Is this easy to use? Is it something that that we can expect to reasonably to develop to cover new situations and to answer questions that we currently can't resolve? Those kinds of concerns seem to me to be quite legitimate in making these choices. And sometimes it helps actually to have several of these. and to have different groups. As you probably realize, I'm a believer in cognitive diversity within the scientific community.
Right.
And so we let a number of different flowers bloom as long as they've got these pragmatic virtues that can help us overcome the problems with which we deal. So the current thrust of my thinking about this is highly pragmatist and highly pragmatic. I'm coming to think of the sciences as delivering to us a whole collection of resources for attacking and overcoming the obstacles that human beings collectively face. And I see science as a socially embedded institution that plays a very important role in doing that. And we should start to think, not in terms necessarily of which one of these underdetermined contenders is the right one, but which one or which ones or which collection of resources of this kind helps us with the problems that we currently face. You'll recognize here again, I think, hints of Dewey. Dewey's thinking, ever since I discovered Dewey about 20 years ago, has really pervaded my approach to all sorts of questions. Basically, because as I learnt from Sidney Morgenbesser, my wonderful emeritus colleague at the time, I was basically doing Dewey without knowing it, just as Monsieur Jourdain was surprised to discover that he had been talking prose all his life. I was just surprised to discover that I'd been a pragmatist all my life.
Very interesting. Do you think that, so a lot of the way you describe your approach there sounds like something that an instrumentalist might say about science. Do you think your view is close to that, or how? In what way do you think you would disagree? That
well, I mean, what the instrumentalist gets right is half of this, namely the importance of having tools for overcoming particular kinds of difficulties and expanding limitations. That's correct, but when you add my defense of success to approximate truth, then what the instrumentalist is missing is that, yeah, the successful tools are the ones that, in a certain sense, get bits and pieces of reality right.
All right. And Hedrit had a question about philosophy of science as well. They were wondering, what is the most difficult field of science to philosophize about, both in thought and academia?
This strikes me as a very interesting question. So I think actually the difficulties of different fields of science are quite various. So it's difficult to do philosophy of physics because philosophers of physics, especially nowadays, really have to know just an incredible amount of mathematics. Learning that is very, very hard. And the people who do it best are incredibly sophisticated mathematically. Chemistry seems difficult to philosophize about because it seems very hard to identify what kinds of problems people in philosophy of chemistry ought to be addressing. And I think that's a field that's struggled to get off the ground. The philosophy of biology in my lifetime has really taken off. I mean, it was virtually nothing when I began my graduate career. And thanks originally to David Hull, and then later on, people like Bill Wimsatt and Michael Roos and Elliot Sober. I mean, it's really become an incredibly sophisticated field. This area is difficult because it seems hard to get away from the problems about evolutionary biology, which is now just a tiny, tiny, tiny piece of the whole biological sciences, and into the problems with respect to molecular and cell biology, It's not easy to see how. I think people have had trouble seeing how to focus problems of cellular and molecular biology. The earth and environmental sciences are desperately urgent, and I'm very glad to see the beginning of work on climate modeling. But the issues that arise here are so profoundly social, I think, that philosophers of science who come to this area really have to start thinking in terms of subjects like ethics and political philosophy if they're going to do any good. And then there are the social sciences. And the philosophy of the social sciences are really, it's in all cases, I think, very important and very hard. And these fields have struggled for decades, really, to try to find their own sort of their own paradigms of questions that should be addressed. I think it's the philosophy of economics in the last decades has started to do much better. And that's because I think there have been a number of serious attempts to look at economic methodology, both within the subject and in relation to social issues. And I think here especially of the work of Nancy Cartwright and the people with whom she's worked.
Great. Speaking of, also, I had another question about science and reductionism. You've put forth some arguments against reductionism in science, both as something that could be done in principle in certain cases, and as something that might get us toward an explanatorily more useful theory.
So there was something really rather curious about this. What I now think is that explanations are highly diverse, and that we shouldn't be thinking about there being a theory of explanation. What we should be thinking about is various kinds of virtues in increasing our understanding of things. And so there are different kinds of questions we can pose, and different kinds of explanation-seeking questions. I mean, philosophers have tended to focus on why questions, as I did, but we sometimes explain what something is, or how it came to be, or how it might have come to be. And all of these kinds of explanation-seeking questions are different, and there are a large number of explanatory virtues and a large number of different kinds of acts of explanation. So I think unification sometimes plays a role, but I don't really want to claim that that's the be-all and end-all. Now, this view was actually taken. There's a great irony here, because in the early, in the late 80s and early 90s, there was a kind of rotating roadshow where Wes Salmon, a very good friend of mine and sometime collaborator of mine, Bas van Fraassen, philosopher I have enormous respect for, and I used to get up in public and talk about explanation, and you could guarantee that it would be a 2 against 1 thing. Wes and I critiqued Bas's pragmatic approach to explanation, and I think the criticism is completely correct. But we missed something, and just before, maybe it was a decade before his death, Wes began to see that there were possibilities of reconciling different theories of explanation, that you didn't need a one-size-fits-all theory. I was slow to come to that. I think that was what Bas very much had in mind. And what we pointed out was that he needed to impose more conditions than he had done, otherwise the account was trivial. But Bas was seeing earlier than anybody else the need for a plurality of kinds of explanation. And I think he got that right. And I think we still don't know how to characterize it. And maybe we don't know how to characterize it for Wittgensteinian reasons. This is one of those cases that Wittgenstein loves so much, where there are all sorts of variations among the kinds of things that get brought under a common term or a common label.
Great. So I wanted to move on to some of your work in ethics. You have a great book called The Ethical Project. I forget, there's a subtitle on that, but very interesting book. And one of the things you emphasize in there is, ethics as an ongoing human project. It focuses more on the project first rather than like the truths, the like independent moral truths. Could you briefly elaborate on your approach here?
Well, I think the best thing I can do is tell you about a book that will appear later this year called Moral Progress, because there's a sense in which I think the Ethical Project book it's a book that was terribly important to me. It took me 25 years to write. It grew out my concern in some of my early writing with human sociobiology, and with E.O. Wilson's famous claim that the time had come for ethics to be removed from the hands of the philosophers and biologicized. I thought that was wrong. But after I had critiqued Wilson's account in 1985, there was this little voice in my ear, and it kept on saying, "All right, well, Professor Kitcher, but you think that ethics, like other aspects of human life, evolved? What's your account of how it came about, eh?" And that got me started, and I worked for decades on trying to come up with a reasonable account of the evolution of ethics and how we might have come to our ethical practices. And that is really where the book, The Ethical Project, begins. And it comes out of that. And then as it goes, it tries to rethink some questions in meta-ethics from the perspective of the historical account that I've given. Towards the end of the book, in what I think turns out to be the most important chapter in the book, which is chapter 9, I start talking about how this bears on method in ethics. Now, I thought about that after the publication of the book even more, and there was another relatively slow gestation, a bit faster. I mean, it really took me about a decade in this case, in which that problem, the question of how we go about in this project making sensible decisions, and the idea that that must be somehow collective, led me back to start thinking very seriously about the history of the progress that we've made at various times. And I'm not sure how much of it there is in human history, but it seems to me there's some. You know, we've abandoned torture, largely. We've abandoned slavery, largely. We've expanded opportunities for women, so on. In my lifetime, I've seen the wonderful abandonment of prejudices against people who love members of their own sex. I mean, that has been a truly striking and heartening phenomenon. In none of these cases is the change complete. I wouldn't want to say that, but progress has been made. So I thought to myself, how did this actually happen? And when I started to look at the history, I realized something that Dewey had already seen, which is that these cases are incredibly contingent. They're bloody, they're messy, and they take a very long time, and they could easily not have resulted in the happy advances that they eventually generated. And that led me, and here I model what I'm doing in this area on what I think Kuhn thought of himself as doing in the structure of scientific revolutions. Take the phenomena seriously and try to see how this works. How is it that you get some sorts of changes and advances? And that's led me in the book that will appear later, I think later this summer, Moral Progress, to an account of moral methodology. And instead of thinking of moral realism or the meaning of moral statements or something like that, or the foundations of ethics as being somehow the principal topic, I think that we should be thinking of this as an ongoing project in which human beings are collectively involved and in which we often flounder and for which we need improved methods. So the aim of the book is to begin an enterprise of recognizing certain methods for expediting moral progress, to make it, in Dewey's terms, more sure-footed and more systematic.
What about the concern that someone might have that, well, given that it's sort of an ongoing project, what if we really aren't very far along in it, in the sense that in the future we might look back at our the moral status of the world today and disgust, right? Maybe we have a lot of it wrong, in other words.
Well, that's actually where I begin. I think it's basically on page 1 of the book that we look back and we can't understand how our ancestors were unable to see the problematic situations that they were in from a moral point of view. I mean, how could well-meaning people come to have accepted slavery or the confinement of women or torture or now what we can hope to do is not, as it were, achieve perfection, but to do better. This is, I think, a great Deweyan lesson. It's not only in Dewey. It's shared, I think, by a number of people whom I think of as non-ideal theorists in thinking about social and political and ethical issues. Amartya Sen is one of them, for example. That what we aim to do is to make things better. We're not, I mean, aspiring to the perfect is probably a bad idea. And this runs deep into my current thinking about things. It's important that our ancestors say about us, well, they were benighted in all sorts of ways, but in a certain sense, they did the best they could to dig themselves out of the situation they were in. And I think that's really the best that we can hope for from their judgment. We shouldn't be discouraged by that. We should be constantly trying to think about improving methods of moral deliberation and moral advance so that we can, as it were, make as much progress as possible, resolve as many of the problems that beset us as possible. That is, I think, the attitude. I mean, the moral philosophy, just as philosophy of science has sometimes been dominated by the idea of a unified science and a unified theory, moral philosophy has been dominated by this thought of a moral truth that is out there that can somehow be presented in a very, very simple and way, and once we've got that, then the world will be perfect, insofar as we can make that, as it were, stick and get people to live by it. I think that's completely wrong. I think that problems and difficulties and limits are always likely to be with us, and that the moral attitude is to try to develop methods for identifying those problems and for overcoming them to the extent that we can.
All right, thanks. That's helpful. I'm looking forward to your book later this summer. I think Timber had a VC question, so if you want to go ahead.
Oh, hi. Thanks for doing the AMA. I had a quick question about can you talk a little bit here about Barry Fodor had this book, like What Darwin Got Wrong, and I believe you were like fairly critical of it. I was just curious if you could maybe elaborate a little bit on like what are the kind of main criticisms you have about his argument? Because I think a lot of people here are familiar with that, sort of take that argument to be good. So I just...
Yeah, I'm surprised actually, given the way in which basically the philosophy of biology community sort of ganged up on Jerry and really rebutted it again and again and again. I think there are a number of difficulties behind the book that he wrote. One of them is a faulty conception of biological theory. That book seems to rest on the idea of a kind of a very old-fashioned kind of view that biology has laws, and so there are, there has to be a certain kind of structure there. Now there isn't that structure, and when I wrote a piece with Ned Block in the I think it's in the Boston Review. Ned and I worked together on this. Ned had some criticisms. I had others. Mine came out of what I thought was Jerry's misunderstandings of biology and how biological explanation works, and those completely infect the arguments that he gives against Darwinism. So I was actually a tremendous admirer of Jerry's. I liked him a lot, and I felt very, very sad because I thought this book was uncharacteristically ignorant and uncharacteristically sloppy. So go and look at the Boston Review article, but also look at I think Samira Kasha wrote an excellent critique. Peter Godfrey Smith wrote an excellent critique. Ed Elliott Sober wrote an excellent critique. Basically, Jerry got bludgeoned by virtually every practicing philosopher of biology.
So would you say that the main disagreement, so when you say like he misunderstands biological theories, is it the case that, do you take like what Sober says about biological theories to be right, that they're just sets of mathematical models essentially?
No, I don't. But I think Elliott's closer to the truth than Jerry is. I think a lot of biology is a lot messier than Elliott thinks. So Jerry, here's the distinction among the three positions. Jerry thinks that biology is an axiomatic system of the sort that Hempel and Carnap would have approved of.
Right.
Elliott thinks it's a collection of mathematical models where you've got all these, you've got the mathematics, and then you've got these special laws that link to bits and pieces of the biological world. I think it's a whole bunch, and this goes back to what I said earlier about explanation, of explanatory strategies that are really quite messy. It's messy. I think it's piecemeal. I think one of the great insights into thinking about lots of areas of science is what I think of as the Stanford program. It comes out of the work of Ian Hacking and Peter Gallison, originally Pat Suppes, and in particular Nancy Cartwright and John Dupre. And I think what they have seen, and I think of Nancy's book, The Dappled World, and John's book, The Disorder of Things, what they see is the real sort of looseness and messiness of the science, and the complete failure of various philosophical attempts to regiment it. Now, Elliott's way of regimenting bits and pieces of biology is sufficiently good as an idealization that it enables him to make some very, very good and very convincing arguments about certain kinds of issues. As a general account of biology, or even as evolutionary biology, I think he's wrong. But the apparatus he sets up, it works very well for getting certain issues clear. The apparatus Jerry uses is just a disaster.
All right. Well, thank you for the answers. I appreciate it.
Great. So just another question in the philosophy of biology from, let's see, who was it here? I think it was from Free Speech, who asked, J.B.S. Haldane observed that teleology is like a mistress to a biologist. He cannot live without her, but he's unwilling to be seen with her in public. What do you make of teleology and biology? I guess you also had that 93 paper.
I'm probably pretty I'm at the skeptical pole of people about teleology. I distinguish teleology from function. So I do think we can make sense of functions, and I took a crack at modifying the various available views some time back, and my paper, Function and Design. So I think function is a perfectly okay concept. I think in general teleology is not a good idea. I mean, it's not a good concept for people to use with respect to biology. So I actually think Haldane was wrong, but I suspect that the mistake arose from his linking of teleology and function, and I think you can make perfectly good sense of function without being teleological. While we're on this subject, I think people who talk about progress tend to think of progress teleologically, and here too, I think there's a dangerous mistake. Given what I said about ethics and morality and the moral project earlier, depends crucially on detaching moral progress from the idea that there's a fixed goal towards which we move, having a non-teleological conception of progress. So I think there's progress from as well as progress to. I don't know, I mean, I'll give you some examples of this. So here we are on computers, and there's been tremendous progress in computer technology since the 1980s. Wonderful. Does that mean that there's a perfect Platonic form of the computer towards which we're headed? No. What it means is that there were certain problems that older computers had, certain limitations that they had, and those are successively overcome. That's what I call pragmatic progress. I think it's all over the place. I think it occurs with respect to scientific change. I think it occurs with respect to moral change. I think it occurs with respect to religious change. I think it occurs in all sorts of fields. And I think we want to, as it were, discard teleological concepts even more thoroughly than we have. So there you are, anti-teleology all the way. If Haldane has a mistress, I'm sorry, I'm going to be very old-fashioned and puritanical. I want to berate him for it.
Fair enough. So I think we've been going for around 50 minutes or so. If you're fine, we'll probably wrap up around here. If that's
I'll take one more question if there's another question, and then we'll call it a day. How about that?
Sure. I think David Lee Roth had a question that he wanted to ask.
Is the microphone?
Unfortunately, your microphone's not working very well.
My microphone isn't?
No. Aiding Cathy.
Okay, so my microphone should be working better now.
Yeah.
I can hear you.
Hi. Yes. First of all, thank you so much for doing this, Professor Kitcher. And yeah, my question was, what is your response to the most common criticisms directed at your form of pragmatism? I was just reading a paper from people from the philosophy of science who believe that this is a very radical shift, so to say. So, what would be your response to some of those criticisms?
Yeah, I don't actually. The question really stymies me because I'm not sure what criticisms you have in mind. A radical shift. I don't. I think radical shifts need to be evaluated on their merits. It's not a criticism to say, "Oh, it's a radical shift." I think some people feel that I've abandoned realism, but I don't think that's correct. I mean, I think I'm like Dewey. I think I'm able to give people the sense of reality that they really want, and to get rid of the philosophical clutter. My pragmatism hasn't led me into a form of relativism, although it has led me to forms of pluralism. I want to say pragmatism, what's the harm in it? It comes with so many good things, and it doesn't seem to do any great disservice to us. Try it. You'll like it. Well, I think I'll stop there.
Great. I think we'll wrap it up around there. Thank you again so much for taking part in this. It's been an honor to have you here. Thank you everyone else for coming to listen as well.
Well, thank you. I enjoyed answering the questions, and it's always nice to engage with people who've been engaging with my work. So I hope some of it's helpful. Thank you very much.